Hey guys, welcome to the first video for chapter 37, and we're going to be getting into World War II here. Now, World War II, obviously, a very big event. The biggest event of the 20th century. A lot of people feel that it is up there in terms of the biggest events in the entire history of the world, and it truly is a world war. Whereas World War I, it involved numerous areas. It still was really centered in Europe. It was still predominantly a European war. While plenty of fighting did take place in Europe, you had fighting throughout the Pacific, you had fighting in Asia, you had fighting in Africa, you had fighting in the Middle East. So you had the conflict was spread out all over the globe in this one. And it also has a bit more resonance to us because it was a little more recent. Now obviously for this modern generation, it's getting farther and farther away, but still, through pictures and through, people that still live through it, there's still a bit of a personal connection to it. All right, so for this first video, we're going to be talking about the origins of the war. Now, we discussed in chapters 35 and 36 how countries like Italy, Germany, and Japan were setting themselves on increasingly belligerent paths. Right, they were militarizing, and it was starting to make some people nervous. Right, so these long simmering trends of militarism, extreme nationalism, international competition, they were now coming to a boil. And it was going to get pretty dangerous. World War I was referred to as the war to end all wars because nobody really thought that a war like that would happen again. They didn't realize that an even worse war was coming on very quickly. So for this video, we're going to look at the origins of the war through the actions of the Axis nations, right? Germany, Japan, Italy. Let's look first at Imperial Japan. Now, some historians debate the actual starting date of World War II. The traditional date is September 1939 when Germany invades Poland and then Great Britain and France declare war. This is a somewhat Western-centric way of looking at it, though, as fighting had been going on in Asia for years by that time. The global conflict's first fighting was actually in 1931 when Japan invaded and conquered Manchuria. Right, so you got Manchuria up here just north of the Korean Peninsula. So you see Japanese territory as of 1928. They were in control of Korea and Taiwan, this little island here. And then in 1931, they take over Manchuria, and that was largely because of its natural resources. Right, but this also gave the militarist ultra-nationalists, right? These were almost quasi-fascist-like group in Japan. It strengthened them. They were dominating Japan's government, and it really bolstered their cause. So Japan's imperialism was condemned by the League of Nations, and that led them to withdraw from the League. And this really showed how powerless the League was. All right, here you have all of the Japanese delegates just picking up their stuff and leaving. Members of the League, they said, you can't do this. And the Japanese delegates said, what are you going to do about it? So they left, and they just went right on doing what they were doing in conquering the Pacific. Now, in 1937, Japan launched a full-on invasion of China. Now, in really under 6 months, Japan had decimated most major Chinese cities. You look it up around here in the Yangtze River, where you've got Beijing and Nanjing, and then down here with Shanghai, they just bombed that and, killed thousands of civilians down there as well. Now, the most notorious instance of it was actually in Nanjing. We'll get to that in a second. But it was very degrading. It was very humiliating to see signs like this, to have... You guys can make it out. To have the Japanese Imperial Army marching through the streets of China. China was the superpower, right? China was the world power in the Pacific, and now its little cousin in some ways is just, rising and also treating them really, really horribly. Case in point, the Rape of Nanjing, also known as the Rape of Nanjing. Now, Nanjing was the Chinese capital at the time, and the Japanese conquest of it was exceptionally brutal. All right. Executions, all right, torture, things of that nature were very common. This is a picture there were 2 Japanese officers that had a running contest for how many Chinese civilians they could behead with their katana blades. And it was actually covered, this contest was covered in the Japanese papers back on the home front. Worked up by war and by feelings of racial superiority, the Japanese soldiers, they engaged in horrific acts of violence against Chinese civilians. Mass executions such as this. Thousands of Chinese women were raped, hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians have killed, and a third of the homes in Nanjing were burned. Now, despite such oppressive tactics, there was still Chinese resistance. One positive side effect of the Japanese invasion and occupation was that it brought together the two sides competing for power in China. Right? You had the two groups that were competing for power prior to the Japanese invasion, and that was the communists Oops. All right, so there's the communists here, all right, red for communists, and then this group here, the nationalists, the Kuomintang. So they both realized that even though they were not particularly friends with each other, it was still uniting to fight a common enemy. However, this wasn't a total friendship. Both sides continued to engage in occasional fighting amongst themselves, and this ended up rendering the resistance against Japan less effective. The side that was looked at as being a little bit better than the other out of this was the communists. The communists proved to be the more effective fighters, and they were seen by the peasants as the more noble defenders of China. This would benefit them in the Chinese Civil War that would follow after World War II ends. Now, even though much of the international community condemned Japan's invasion of China, nobody really did anything about it. Western nations were consumed by the Great Depression and also worrying about war starting in Europe. Plus, Japan protected itself by signing the Tripartite Pact. This was with Germany and Italy in 1940. Right here you've got Mussolini, here you've got Hitler, and there you have Hideki Tojo, the Japanese foreign minister, not the emperor. The emperor didn't take part in this. That was all Tojo's deal. So this essentially solidified the Axis powers. And then on top of it, also signed a neutrality act with USSR. So Japan just felt that it was well protected, especially from the United States. Now, let's talk about Italy. Now, Italians suffered a great deal in World War I, and the economy was in shambles following it. There was also anger about being left out of the Paris peace process. Mussolini used these feelings of anger and resentment to his advantage in pushing for an expansionist policy. The first area Italy conquered was Ethiopia in 1935. They added this into their Libyan and Balkan territories. Right? Libya they actually took over back in 1911, but here's Ethiopia down here, okay, around the Horn of Africa. And this, created an overseas empire for him. This infuriated other nations. Now, it really wasn't so much that Italy had conquered another territory. That would be very hypocritical because European nations still had big empires. It was more that the excessive force, based on the amount of troops and firepower that Italy sent. Italy only lost about 5,000 or 6,000 troops, and over 100,000 Ethiopians were killed. So Italy never really expanded much beyond this, though. Its only other major involvement in another country was getting involved in the Spanish Civil War. Now, this was fought between supporters of the Spanish Republic, the Republicans, and nationalists who were supporters of the fascist general Francisco Franco. Here you see him talking with Mussolini. This is Franco in the middle right here, and then you got Mussolini here. I do not know who this gentleman is, but they were tight. It's both Hitler and Mussolini. They obviously sent, supported Franco, and they sent ammunition, weapons, supplies to back him up. Okay, and that ultimately led to the fascist victory. Plus, the Republicans received aid from the U.S., and this kind of made this a sort of proxy war before the real war started, before both sides. Now, German aggression. Whereas Italy just kind of got on other countries' nerves with its conquest in Africa, Germany was making people really, really nervous in Europe. One of Hitler's main goals was to totally undo the restrictions put on Germany by the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler blamed it, along with Jews and communists, for all of Germany's problems. He also blamed neighboring areas in Europe, making them targets for him to use his newly built-up military against. He set out on a systematic campaign of territorial expansion. All right, so let's look at the different regions here. The first one is this area here. You see it known as the Rhineland. This was a demilitarized zone between France and Germany that had long been contested between the two sides, going back hundreds of years. It was made demilitarized after World War I, so that's the first area. Hitler comes in and says, we're taking this. He goes, but this was always Germany anyway. So the rest of Europe goes, okay, no problem. After that, he has the Anschluss, okay, this union with Austria. So March of 1938, that officially comes on board. Now, at this point, he justified it by saying Austria is practically Germany. Hitler himself was Austrian. So he goes, there really isn't that anything big about it. He goes, it's not conquest, it's just reunification. So the rest of Europe says, okay, we'll give you that one too. Now at this point, he goes after this, the Sudetenland, okay, this region you see kind of around the perimeter of Czechoslovakia. This was mostly inhabited by ethnic Germans. Again, he claimed it was about bringing Germans together, and again, the European nations allowed it to happen. This policy that the other European nations followed was known as appeasement. Appeasement means that they gave in to Hitler's demand in the interest of preserving peace. All right, here you look at the political cartoon here. It's tough for you to make out, but you've got Britain and France all the way on the end. So you've got the big German army just kind of crushing Austria and all of these other areas, and said, why should we have to take a stand, seeing how he's pushing somebody else and it's so far away, right? So he's just putting it off for another time. This was accomplished at the Munich conference. Let me move me down here a little bit. Oh, whatever. You guys got the idea. Here you've got Hitler. Here you've got Mussolini. Here you've got British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. You've got Daladier, the French president. I cannot remember who that guy is, but those are the four big ones: Britain, France, Germany, Italy. And at this one, the goal of countries like Britain and France was to preserve peace, even if it meant making major concessions. The wounds of World War I were still fresh, and so a lot of the continent was opposed to war. Pacifism was sweeping through during the 1920s. Plus, the Great Depression was still hurting economies, and they were a little intimidated by how quickly Hitler had built up Germany's military. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain actually returned home triumphant and declared that they had achieved, quote, peace for our time. Winston Churchill, and this was before he became prime minister, was a fierce critic of the agreement. He stated, "We had the choice between war and dishonor. We chose dishonor. We will have war." So he says a guy like Hitler isn't going to stop, and he was right. Hitler had no intention of abiding by the agreement. And eventually, the invasion of Poland would seal the deal for this. Let me just get rid of this stuff. Okay, so Poland, September 1939, that, as I said, is generally accepted as the beginning of World War II, and at this point, the Western nations realized that they had made a mistake. This was September 1st, and it's very difficult for you to make out, but the date on this newspaper is September 3rd, 1939, so only 2 days later, England and France declare war on Germany, and the war on Europe officially begins. All right, so that talks about how the war got started, and in the next video, we're going to talk about how it was truly an example of total war.